Good day to have an all-around smart guy like Steve Hayes here. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Morning, guys. How's it going?
All right, we're doing well. I want to start by talking about the situation in Syria. I mean, gosh, it looks very, very serious. There are beginning to look like increasingly credible reports that chemical weapons, gas, was used against the civilian population, and it looks like it may have come from the direction of the government against the people. As you look at this, do you find those reports credible, and if so, what do you think about it?
You know, it's hard to tell initially. I mean, certainly the video that we saw coming out was consistent with the kinds of reactions and the kinds of symptoms that you'd see from people who are gassed, people foaming at the mouth, what have you. The Israeli defense minister came out this morning and said that their intelligence had determined that it was, in fact, the use of gas. It was likely the Syrian regime, and that the gas was probably sarin gas, or was sarin gas. So you had some confirmation, at least from a Western intelligence service. And others, I mean, the French had a forward-leaning statement today saying, in effect, if it was gas, and it seems to have been chemical weapons that were used.
But the president said that was a red line.
Yeah, in fact, let's remind everyone of what the president said about a year ago, actually.
A red line for us is we start saying a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
So now what, Steve Hayes?
Yeah, well, he said being moved around or being utilized. I mean, we've had credible reports of chemical weapons being moved around almost since the day he said that. And then, of course, we've had previous confirmed reports of the use of chemical weapons. So the red line has already been breached. The president, in that statement that you just played, promised that there would be enormous consequences if the regime used chemical weapons. We've seen no consequences. I mean, to the extent there have been any hints of consequences, it's the administration saying that they were likely to increase aid to some rebel groups. But in terms of actually, if you're Bashar Assad and you're in the United States and the Western world, you haven't seen any consequences to speak of for this crossing this line that everybody agreed would have to trigger some kind of a serious and significant response.
All right, so, the president said if you use or move around chemical weapons, that's a red line. We now know chemical weapons have apparently been used. No reaction to it. When you do that, when you throw down the gauntlet and then you don't follow through, that really has the impact of sort of destroying your credibility, not just in that region, but all over the world, because it means that you don't mean what you say. Yes,
that's absolutely right. And in fact, President Obama made that argument himself about empty words back when he was defending U.S. intervention in Libya back in March of 2011. And he was talking about the United Nations, talking about the United States, and the promises at that point to intervene in Libya to prevent a massacre. And then the United States, of course, did intervene militarily. And the president, in explaining that, his decision to intervene there, said we couldn't afford a situation where our words and the words of international institutions like the UN became empty words, because it would mean that in the future, when we made similar threats, those threats would have no credibility. So the president has laid out the problem, I think, quite well. Now it's the case that you hear Josh Earnest yesterday at the podium at the White House saying, we find these activities, if true, reprehensible, and we condemn them in the strongest possible way. Nobody cares. I mean, nobody cares what the United States says at this point.
And I point everyone to Steve Hayes' latest column at the Weekly Standard. In fact, the headline is Obama's Empty Words, focusing on that and really the box that he has sort of painted himself into, or corner had painted himself into. Steve, if I could shift for a minute to Al-Qaeda and the president's position with Al-Qaeda and the reality of Al-Qaeda in the world right now compared to the campaign rhetoric we heard in 2012. We had Eli Lake on earlier, and I don't know if you've read his latest column, really detailing. Yeah, it's chilling, the details that he has now on this internet conference of these 20 Al-Qaeda leaders. This, of course, is the conference that led to the shutdown of our embassies across the Muslim world. And you hear the leader of Al-Qaeda talking about the U.S. and likening our role in the Middle East right now to the last days of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe before the wall came down. And this is not really the war on Al-Qaeda the president promised the American people, is it?
It's not, and it's hard to overstate just how important these two pieces from Eli Lake and Josh Rogan are, because they really sort of undermine the administration's paradigm going back now several years about al-Qaeda and its growth. I mean, the administration, remember, kept saying al-Qaeda's on the path to defeat, al-Qaeda's basically on the verge of being extinguished. John Brennan, the president's top counterterrorism advisor, gave a speech to the Woodrow Wilson Center back in the spring of 2012 in which he said this would be the decade in which we'd see al-Qaeda disappear, and said al-Qaeda's core wasn't any longer relevant. Well, the problem is we've seen dramatic growth in al-Qaeda by its affiliates, but the distinction between al-Qaeda core and the affiliates that the president and his advisors have made, they've overstated it. The al-Qaeda core has been guiding and directing and assisting in the growth of the affiliates, and what you've had is, in effect, a diffusion of al-Qaeda, but nonetheless a strong threat continuing.
Has the president and his team completely misjudged the strength of al-Qaeda and the real threat that they still pose?
Yeah, I think so, and that goes back. You know, it's not just the campaign rhetoric. You go to the president's speech that he gave May 23rd at the National Defense University, where he, in effect, declared an end to the global war on terror and said, we just don't face the kind of threats that we once did in the days leading up to September 11th and in its aftermath. I just think that's wrong. I think we still do face significant threats, the possibility of a mass casualty attack or the use of some kind of weapon of mass destruction against U.S. interests, against U.S. personnel overseas, or even possibly here, not only can't be ruled out, but I think we have with the rise of the affiliates, we have a much more difficult time tracking some of the activity of al-Qaeda, which makes it even more difficult.
Domestically speaking, the president's back from his vacation. Won't be long before Congress wanders back into town. And I think that they probably have gotten an earful, members of Congress, about Obamacare. And there has started to be some mainstream reporting about the impact of Obamacare on employment, cutback of hours, etc. As we go forward toward the end of the year, and there will be an effort to apparently defund Obamacare, how do you see that playing out?
Well, here's the most interesting and important development, I think, that we've seen during this recess. You went into the recess, and I think the leadership, or significant parts of the leadership of the Republican Party, were going into the recess with the assumption that these fall fights that we are about to have on budget and funding the government and debt ceiling were likely to take place without including Obamacare. So that is to say, you know, John Boehner, I think, and Mitch McConnell were not likely to put Obamacare at the center of their arguments on the debt ceiling or on funding of the government. I think that's shifted now, in part because of this effort to defund Obamacare. I don't think it's likely. I mean, the defunding Obamacare movement it's not going to actually happen at this point. It's fair to say that. But what it's done is I think it illustrated to people in Washington, people in leadership on the Republican side, that there's a significant hunger out there among grassroots conservatives to really challenge the president. And I think you are now going to see Republicans link a delay of some kind of Obamacare's implementation with the debt ceiling, which is a pretty big development.
All right, Steve Hayes, always good to have you, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. And
absolutely, guys. Thanks for the bull shark.
We count on you not to give us any bull shark.
Steve, and cap season is right around the corner, Steve. So fire up.
It's like 50 days to hawk it.
But who's counting?
Everyone's counting. Yeah.
All right.